Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on passenger rights. Today, I hope everyone is well and safe today, and that you're having a good start of the morning. Before we start by presenting the webinar and the speakers, I wanted to just share some logistical information. So you can find the link to access the real-time captioning on the chat box, which should be to your right. The webinar will also have international sign language interpretation, as you can probably see right now. If you have any technical issues, you can ask from now on my colleague Raquel in the chat box on your right as well. And if you need to download the presentation to the webinar, we have the presentation available in the box called Handouts. So you should be able to download it yourself and follow it. During the webinar, all participants will remain muted in order to avoid sound problems. But at the end of the webinar, we will have 15 minutes to answer some questions. We'll take these questions through the question box on the right. And you can use the question box at any time. We will take note for the end. So you can start asking questions from now. The webinar will also be recorded, and we'll share the video with subtitles afterwards with all participants and through our website. However, the attendees will remain anonymous and will not say any names out loud for privacy reasons. We will also not share the video of the speakers. You will be able to see the presentation in the screen, but you will not be able to see the speakers for technical reasons. Before I pass to an overview, I want to thank our sign language interpreters, Ferdinand and Lisa, and our real-time captioner, Tina, for their work. I will now give a short overview. The webinar will consist in two parts. We will give an overview on passengers' rights regulations at EU level, and these are nominally air passengers' rights, rail passengers' rights, bus and coach, and sea and inland waterways. And in a second part, we will talk about how the regulations and the current status of the regulations and the EDF positions and advocacies. And at the end, as I said, we'll have a short time for questions. A bit about EDF now. We are an organization with over 100 members, and we defend the rights of over 100 million persons with disabilities in Europe. Very briefly, we are based in Brussels, and we focus and we fight for the full implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and to uphold the right of persons with disabilities in the EU, its member countries, and also in Europe in general. Now I will present our two speakers, and then I will give them the floor. So we'll start with Mher Hakobyan. Mher is our Accessibility Officer, and you'll give an overview of what the European Union is doing on the rights of passengers that, as I said, use a series of travel modes: air, train, maritime travel, buses, and coach services. You will explain what and how the EU guarantee the rights of persons with disabilities if they travel, and what pieces of legislation the EU is working on to improve these rights. In a second, our second speaker will be Mher Denninghaus, our Policy Coordinator, and she will share EDF's positions and recommendations to improve the rights of passengers with disabilities in all these transport modes. She will also explain the upcoming actions and initiatives of the EU and how we can engage with them. And finally, there is me. I'm moderating for this webinar. I'm Andre Felix. I'm the EDF Communications Coordinator. After these short introductions, I will now give the floor to Mher Hakobyan.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me well. Good morning, everybody. So as Andre mentioned, we will today talk about the EU laws that protect the rights of passengers. And these are, as again he mentioned, into 4 different transport modes: air, train, bus and coach, and also water transport. But so next slide, please. But before we start presenting this, I want to mention 2 important things. First of all, I want to say that we will talk about regulations, and why this is important is because regulations are the strongest legal tool in EU's toolbox, so to say, which means that when they're adopted at EU level, they are directly binding, and they apply to all of the addresses that the regulation aims to address in the text. So that's can apply directly to the EU countries or the services and citizens that it addresses. And the member states cannot really choose to apply what parts of the regulation they want unless the regulation text allows them to do in certain parts. So the regulation itself will mention that on certain provisions they can have exemptions, but other than this they cannot choose and pick. So the next important thing is that all of these regulations oblige EU countries to designate a special body, which are called national enforcement bodies, or in short, we always say NEBs or NEBs, you can hear sometimes, that these bodies are there to ensure that the EU law is properly followed. And one of the functions in this is also to ensure that rights of passengers are respected. So any passenger who believes that their right under the regulations have been breached, they can contact the national enforcement body where the incident took place, and they can raise their complaints and issues with them. At the end of this webinar presentation, you will find the contact links to the national enforcement bodies. So the regulations that we will mention today, the first on air are three. There's a general one, there is a specific one when harm is caused to passenger or their belongings, and there is one specific regulation on persons with, in the regulation it's called rights of disabled persons and persons with reduced mobility. And then we have general regulation for rights of rail passengers with a specific chapter on disability rights. The same goes for bus and coach, sea and inland waterways. So next slide, please. So the first one is on air, and you can see a white airplane on a blue sky background. Very nice picture. We will see if this reflects the state of the protection of rights of citizens or not. So next one. First of all, I would like to say that often you will hear that when we talk about regulations, we name them by their numbers. So let's say this regulation is 261. Often in discussions with like EU law discussions, you can hear like regulation 261 or regulation 1107. This is kind of the jargon that is used, but in discussions. So first one is, as I said, regulation 261. This is a general regulation on general rights of passengers, of all passengers, including passengers with disabilities. It states the rules on compensation and assistance to passengers, and by assistance here I mean meals and accommodation, not specific assistance to persons with disabilities. And this in case of denied boarding or in case of flight cancellations, or and it also or long delays. So by denied boarding, I want to again note that this is not about denied boarding, which we will talk about a bit later, when passengers with disabilities sometimes or often face when they're denied boarding because of the disability. But this is about when you have an overbooked flight and then the airline calls for some volunteers to step down, and because of the overbooking. And when they don't find enough volunteers to do this, then they can deny boarding to passengers against their will, in which case they have to compensate them. But here, important thing to note also is that airlines, when doing this practice, they have to give priority for boarding to persons with reduced mobility and any other person that is accompanying them. If you have a cancellation, then the airline is obliged to care for you, which means like refreshments, meals, hotel accommodation if needed, and then they have to reimburse the cost of the ticket within 7 days, or provide you with a return flight to your first point of departure, or a rerouting option. And on certain cases, they have to compensate you. So the difference between reimbursement and compensation is that reimbursement is the refund of the price of the ticket that you paid, and compensation can be in addition to this as a kind of a, yeah, to compensate your kind of time or the difficulty that was caused to you. So the compensation is only on conditions where there's a passenger is not informed sufficiently before, and these are like in general 2 weeks in advance. This does not apply if the airline can prove that the cancellation was due to extraordinary circumstances, which is important, especially now during COVID confinement measures. We will talk about this a bit later at the end of my presentation. And the airline is also obliged to provide clear information about the cancellation or delay of your flight. In this regulation, there is a point that this information has to be accessible for blind and partially sighted persons. It does not specify how this should be done, but the obligation is stated in the law. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the next regulation is Regulation 889. This is about liability. So it's about the airline's obligation to compensate for any loss or distraction or damage to your luggage. That's both check-in luggage and carry-on, but also this includes any harm that is caused to the passenger, for example, any injury or even death cases. So the compensation for your luggage, according to this law, is approximately 1,290 euro. But you can, before taking the flight at the check-in, you can make a special declaration of value, which is a form you fill, and sometimes you're required to pay a fee. And then in this, you can state the value of your, let's say, luggage. Then the airline has to compensate more. And this is important for many persons with disabilities who carry, who have a mobility equipment, which is a lot of the times, you know, much more expensive than 1,290 euros. So this can ensure that when something happens, you are fully refunded or compensated for this. And for all these things, there are time limits for complaints and for court actions. The law also states certain limitations before you have to take action. Otherwise, your right to this compensation would expire. The next slide, please. So the next regulation, the third one that I talk about air, is a specific one. It's the only specific regulation on the rights of disabled persons and persons with reduced mobility that we have in transport. Just to note that in EU laws, this is how it's defined: rights of disabled persons and persons with reduced mobility. So this can also include persons with temporary reduced mobility due to accidents, for example, or older persons who need assistance. But generally, we often say persons with disabilities when we talk, meaning all of these people also. So this also has provisions on guaranteeing that persons with disabilities are not refused reservation or boarding due to their disability. So this is a non-discriminatory access insurance for persons with disabilities. And also they have the right that they get free of charge assistance at the airport and also in the aircraft. Next slide, please. But of course, there is some caveats that the law also says that even though you have the right to board and you cannot be denied boarding, but under certain circumstances, this can actually happen. Marie will talk more about this a bit later, but just to note shortly, it's basically arguments about safety requirements, and if the size of the aircraft doesn't make it physically possible for the person to enter the aircraft. In this law, there is no protection guaranteed for damaged or lost mobility equipment. So this is also negative in this law, and we will talk again about EDF's position a bit later. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next regulation I will mention is the rail regulation. You see an image of a white and red train at the platform. This is again about general rights of all passengers, including passengers with disabilities. And this part about disability rights is covered under Chapter 5. To go to the next slide, I will again shortly give an overview of the general rights. These mostly apply to long distance travel, which means urban, regional and suburban rail travel is mostly exempt from the regulation. But to be a bit more specific, the parts that countries can make exemptions on are, as I said, purely domestic railway services, but this they can do for a maximum of 15 years after the regulation came into force. There are permanent exemptions that countries can make about urban, suburban, and regional travel. And also there is exemptions for 5 years, which can be renewed again later, for any rail service which has a significant part of its service outside the EU. So this is, I think, important more for countries that are on the borders of the EU, that they have they have neighboring countries which are bordering the EU, so to say. So certain provisions of the regulations are actually mandatory, which is rules on availability of tickets, liability for passengers and their luggage, right to transport of passengers with reduced mobility, information on accessibility of rail services, and obligations on passengers' personal security. This also includes compensations and reimbursement conditions, and effective complaint mechanisms. So to go to the next slide, we will talk specifically what the law ensures for persons with disabilities. That, as I said, is right to access to transport at no additional charge. This also applies for urban, suburban, and regional rail. Also, information concerning the accessibility of rail services and stations. This has to be requested before. This again applies for all rail travel, including local trains. And there is a guarantee of free of charge assistance on board trains and at staffed stations, which is important because sometimes the argumentation is that some stations are too small and they don't have staff, so the provision cannot be insured. And there is a pre-notification time in the current EU law for 48 hours in advance. In this law, it's a good point that you would be compensated fully for your lost and damaged mobility equipment. So unlike in the air regulation that we discussed. Next mode of transport is, next slide, please. Okay, bus and coach. Again, this is a regulation on the rights of all passengers. You can see a parked blue and black coach bus, sort of, in these colors. And the regulation chapter that applies to a person with disabilities is Chapter 3. So the next slide, we will again give a small overview. We have to say that a regulation applies to ordinary bus and coach services that carry passengers along specific routes with predetermined pickup and stopping points. So not all bus and coach services would go under this, but specific lines, operating lines, and that have specific stops that the law actually mentions. And in general, the law is applicable to travel for long distance bus and coach travel, which means 250 kilometers or more distance. Under this, you have a guarantee for assistance. Again, assistance means general assistance for like providing refreshments, meals, when there is need to accommodate at a hotel. Under certain circumstances, you have right to compensation, reimbursement, rerouting in case of delays and cancellations. You have a right to get information about your canceled or delayed service, and you have to be protected in case of road accidents. So the next slide, this part applies to all travel, so it doesn't matter if it's more than 250 kilometers or less. This is a non-discrimination provision based on nationality, so nobody can deny you the ticket or to board the bus based on nationality. There's also that you have to get information about your travel, for example, timetable or something like this, and also that the services have to provide you with the information about your rights as a passenger. And this information provision also notes that the information must be accessible for disabled persons and persons with reduced mobility. This can be in large print, plain language, braille, or audio tapes, which is a very good point in terms of accessibility information. There are also provisions on how to make complaints and how the mechanisms work. And then we go to the next slide, which is a bit more specific on the rights of persons with disabilities. It applies for all distances. As I said, there is a non-discriminatory treatment to access the transport equally as other passengers. But again, there is a small caveat where we have, again, safety concerns raised to go against this right by services, and also if the vehicle design the vehicle design itself also can be a denial to right to transport. And then the good thing again here is that you have full compensation for loss or damage of mobility equipment. For long distance travels, you have a right to assistance free of charge at designated terminals. This means not all at all stops, but there are again a list of stops where you have the right to assistance. This is linked in the presentation. You can then check which stops these are. You have to pre-notify 36 hours in advance. And where it's necessary, transport free of charge of an accompanying person is also ensured under this law. So the final transport mode is sea and inland waterways. And this is again a general regulation on all passengers' rights with a specific chapter on disability. That's chapter 2. You see an image of a white and red cruise ship at South Harbor of Helsinki. It's very beautiful. So again, to give a very short overview. Next slide, please. So the law protects the rights of all passengers when traveling on large ferries and cruise ships on sea, rivers, lakes, and canals in the EU. Large is a key word here because there are exemptions based on, for example, the ship size. If the ship is carrying up to 12 passengers, this does not apply. If the ship has up to 3 persons who are the crew members, again, this does not apply. If there's passenger services that travel less than 500 meters in one way, this also doesn't apply to them. And excursion and sightseeing tours other than cruises and ships not propelled by mechanical means, they also don't go under this regulation. And then there's also some small specific private there's other also exemptions, but these are not so important at the moment. You can check later in the links if you want. There's more detailed information. So the law again guarantees reimbursement, compensation, or rerouting in case of cancellations or delays. I have to note here that this does not apply to cruise ships. So if you have a cruise booked and then it gets canceled, you cannot claim a reimbursement or compensation. And then you guaranteed assistance again in case of delays or cancellations. Again, this is about meals, accommodation, this kind of assistance. Then you have the right to information about the travel arrangements and your rights as passengers. And the law also provides the details about how to make complaints and what are the complaint handling procedures. Next slide is focusing more on the rights of persons with disabilities. Again, you have the right to non-discriminatory access to transport, but again, safety and ship and port design can be made as arguments for denial of right to transport. And we know that if we talk, for example, about port design or ship design, there's a lot of accessibility barriers. So this can in the end mean that you are denied boarding or you cannot board the ship, and you cannot blame the service for being discriminatory to you, which is of course not a good way to protect passengers' rights. Then you have a right to assistance free of charge for both at port terminals and on board the ships. This is specific assistance to persons with disabilities and reduced mobility. And then you have compensation for loss or damage of mobility equipment, either at the replacement value or its repaired value. So if you this, I guess, has to be discussed with the service. I'm not sure if the law is very specific on this. Okay, so I finished about the rights that are guaranteed under the regulations in these 4 transport modes. But we just recently found out that the Commission, of course, issued some explanations how these rights can be affected because of COVID-19, and I want to mention this very briefly. So the Commission issued what is called interpretive guidelines. It means like how to interpret the regulations during COVID-19, and this applies to 4 specific regulations. So in air, it's only applies to the general regulation, not to the one that is about passengers with disabilities. And also in rail, bus, and coach and sea and inland waterways, also these regulations are affected by COVID-19. So the next slide. Okay, there are of course some small details and differences, but in general, as a general rule, passengers' rights in case of delays and cancellations are guaranteed. Again, also in COVID-19 situation for a reimbursement, so you would get a refund for your travel, or be offered the rerouting at the earliest opportunity. But since we live now in very uncertain period, and at earliest opportunity is not really known to anybody what this can mean. So you can also be offered rerouting at a later date, which is convenient to you. So this is only guaranteed if the transport service cancels your service themselves. If you are the one that decides not to travel, for example, you feel unsafe to travel, or you are a bit sick, then they don't have, they are not obliged to do this reimbursement or rerouting. But many services have special offers now because of the situation, so you can directly discuss with them what your options are. But in general, they have the right to information, care and assistance, and then which means reimbursement, rerouting, which also apply under the extraordinary circumstances of COVID-19. But here the exemption, there are some exemptions, for example, for air and water transport, the force majeure, which means like situations like COVID and the confinement measures, they can be used for the transport services not to compensate you. So they have to still reimburse you, but you cannot claim extra compensation. Also, if the airline cancels your flight 2 weeks in advance, you cannot claim compensation, but only they have to reimburse you. There is no exemption for rail. So the COVID-19 measures don't apply to rail. You can still ask for compensation. And for bus and coach, only severe weather conditions are considered as extraordinary circumstances. So again, this cannot be used to for example, not provide you with accommodation if you're stranded somewhere. But you have to be careful that in different countries, you might also have different national laws. So this is, I give you general guidance on the EU level, but in different countries, you might have some differences. So here I finish my presentation. Again, I want to highlight that at the end, you can find links to the all the laws and also explanations and summaries, which can be very helpful. And I pass the floor now to my colleague Marie, who will talk more about the current status of the laws and also what our positions are on them. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Mher. I think this was a great introduction. Most important things have been said. What I will do now is that I will go more into detail about what is happening right now and what EDF's position is on these developments, and most importantly, how you also as stakeholders, as EDF members, can give feedback and get involved to improve these regulations. So what is happening is that actually the Commission at the moment is evaluating several of these regulations. Amongst others, it is the regulation on air passengers' rights for persons with disabilities, the bus and coach, and the maritime and inland waterway regulations. They will be evaluated as a package. And this is planned now for this year and next year. So this is really important for us to know, because how it works is that the Commission is basically giving a contract to an external consultancy who will do interviews, they will do studies, they will collect data on how these regulations are working at the moment, where the problems are and how they could be improved. And then they will give recommendations based on these studies on if there should be an actual evaluation, an actual revision, so to change the text of these regulations and to start a new legislative procedure, or if basically they say everything is fine, we don't need to change it, or there only need to be some small interpretations that have to be given to clarify certain aspects. Then also we have ongoing legislative procedures at the moment, and this is mainly the Rail Passengers' Rights Regulation, which I will go also into detail. But importantly, for these two mechanisms that are going on at the moment, it is a possibility to improve the texts. Because as you have heard from what Mher says, all of these regulations, they are not perfect and they have certain weaknesses. And I can maybe summarize this, that in all regulations, we have the same issues to different extents. In all regulations, there is an issue of where safety reasons can be put against the right to access and the right to travel for persons with disabilities. So it's really difficult to weigh up what is now a safety measure. And I give the example later in rail as well, where, for example, the captain of the plane can decide from just looking at you whether you are deemed to be fit to travel by yourself, if you are not if you are disabled or not. So these are really problems that we see in all transport modes, but mainly in rail. Then a big problem, as you also know, is that the inaccessibility of vehicles is not at all addressed in these regulations. We have some separate regulations, for example, in rail, which also address the technical accessibility of the trains, but this, for example, does not exist for air. So there is no approach to actually making airplanes more accessible in order to facilitate travel. And we think this is a big gap in all the regulations on passengers' rights, that they guarantee you a right to travel, but without actually addressing the ability, the enabling factors, which is mainly the accessibility of the stations, the airports, the vehicles, etc. Also, we criticize in all regulations that assistance should be booked in advance, in some cases up to 2 days in advance, which is way too long. The transport providers should make an effort to provide you assistance anyways, but as Mher mentioned, for example, in stations, in small stations, it is not possible because there is no staff, so you will have to somehow pre-notify, and even if you turn up, you can still be lucky that you get assistance. Furthermore, the quality of assistance in all transport modes is in practice often questionable. You probably all have had that experience, that even if you book assistance, there is nobody there, there's too many other people, the staff is overwhelmed with too many requests. So for example, at the airport, they will maybe take 2 or 3 passengers at the same time, even though they have to go to different gates, which causes delays, or passengers are forgotten on airplanes and they have to wait a long time to get to actually disembark the plane. So the quality of assistance is also something to be addressed in all modes. And finally, the exemptions that Mher mentioned, I think, is also important. So the scope often excludes urban and regional transport modes. This is, for example, clear in the rail passengers regulation, whereas as what the rights of persons with disabilities concerns, we are still relatively lucky because this chapter is excluded from the exemptions, you could say, but still you are a passenger, so you would also maybe like to get a compensation if your regional train is delayed and not only if your long distance train is delayed. And I also think this is really important because at the moment we have no EU regulations whatsoever addressing rights of passengers in urban transport. So anything that is about metros, trams, local buses, this is completely out of the picture here. And of course, this should be improved. So this is the general overview, the comment on all the regulations, and I will now go into detail into each transport mode. So as I said, for the air regulation, the one on passengers with disabilities, there is at the moment a roadmap. So a roadmap, what it means in EU speak is that it's before the EU is actually considering really changing it. They do a kind of test where they ask for the opinions of all different stakeholders and look into if there should be a study or if there should be an evaluation. And so this looks into how effectively the current regulation is working, whether it's responding to all the challenges. For example, it can be now that also with COVID-19, these are new challenges. And as you maybe remember, a few years ago in air travel, the ash cloud disaster in Iceland was really a huge game changer for air travel. And this is actually still under discussion. And you can imagine such an immense impact on travel as COVID-19 has had, it might have to be reflected also in the EU regulation. So this is responding to challenges that could now actually come up and maybe open up also a new angle for us to improve the rights of passengers with disabilities. So there was already this first consultation in last summer. It was in a very inconvenient time. It was in July, I think. So I hope you saw it, but it might have passed under people's radar. We replied, but this was the first, let's say, kind of roadmap, and now they will look into actually doing the study. So we are not 100% sure yet if there will be a revision, but it is a start. And so we have already been contacted by the consultancy, the external consultant, which is tasked by the Commission to do the study, which is STEER. They might also get in touch with you separately. So if you get an email from them, don't delete it. It's quite important because they do the study, and we need to give as much detailed input as we can. And it's also really important to give input from the national level, because this is not information that EDF necessarily has, because we look at the bigger picture. So if you know, for example, there are specific problems at Copenhagen Airport with assistance, then please notify STEER and tell them what the problems are, so this can be reflected in the study. Also, I think it's, again, as I mentioned in the introduction, the biggest challenge for this regulation is the issue of being denied boarding because of your disability. There are many, many cases, and unfortunately, there is no obligation at the moment for airlines to somehow record this data or actually give this data to the authorities. So we have no real data that actually tells us how many cases there are. But what we get to hear from EDF, even just from colleagues that travel and they have had these problems in the past several times, I can imagine that the problem is quite extensive. So it's a shame that this is still happening, and it can happen, as I said, on a very random basis. So just one person, one staff can say, you look like you're not fit to travel, so you cannot travel, even though you have bought a ticket, you have a valid reservation, you have booked assistance in time, everything is fine on paper, or they say you have to travel with an assistant. And then obviously, what do? You are alone at the gate. So where are you going to get an assistant from? So this is at the moment the biggest challenge that we want to address. But there are other small issues as well with the regulations. For example, it is not clear when we talk about guide dogs or service animals. So this is not clarified because they mention only certified guide dogs according to national law. And this also varies a lot. So there we have to make sure that, for example, traveling with a guide dog has to become easier as well. And somebody with a guide dog cannot be denied boarding because of that, or lack of documentation, etc. So there are a lot of issues under this regulation that should be addressed. And I would say this is our priority. But of course, the other transport modes are also relevant. And now I'm switching to the next slide, which is on rail, where I mentioned that actually we are at the moment in an active legislative procedure. So here we have the best chance at the moment, or the highest chance, to actually make concrete changes. And our biggest issue is, and I highlighted it here in bold, is this issue of pre-notification of assistance of 48 hours, which is really a ridiculous amount of time. If you want to travel spontaneously, this is the opposite of spontaneous. And there are member states such as Spain, such as the Netherlands, that have either completely abolished this pre-notification period, or it is down to 1 hour, as in the Netherlands, which is more realistic. In Belgium, they have done it for some of the bigger stations. So we really think this is possible everywhere. But, and I have to say, the political resistance is really, really, really strong. So there's a lot of lobbying from industry going on, of course, from the transport operators, but it's also that the member states, so the council in this case, is really opposed to making, let's say, the rules stricter in general. So we have had this in what is called the trialogue. So when the different institutions are negotiating, which is happening actually right now, although there is probably at the moment a little break because of the corona crisis. So it might anyways be a little bit delayed, but it doesn't look good at the moment. So even the European Parliament, which had a much more ambitious position in the beginning, is now starting to soften a little bit, and they kind of want to go back to, and they want to go back to maybe 24 hours, and this is obviously not a really good solution for us. So we are really lobbying actively, but we also need the support of the member states, because they are in fact the ones who have the last word. We are actively lobbying, so we have an open letter which is linked here in this slide that we wrote to the EU leaders, and we actually started a signature campaign, which you may have seen, where we got nearly 60,000 signatures. And it was really went really fast, and within 3 days I think we were already over 30,000. So we can see that it is a big concern from the member states, from the passengers themselves, obviously. So member states can still influence the position, which means that you can also still influence it if you can contact your national governments and explain to them why this is so important. And all the arguments you can also find in our official position. And this we have linked later in the slides, as Mher mentioned. Then we go to bus and coach, and this is a similar situation also for maritime. So I will explain a little bit, like it's a similar roadmap, a similar timeline. And there it's also part of this evaluation study that I mentioned for Regulation 1107, so on air passengers' rights. And they had already the roadmap, and now actually they have workshops scheduled, and this I hope will not be delayed now with Corona. This is also done by the consultancy Steer. So they will also do interviews of specific stakeholders, and they also do things like questionnaires where they try to collect data. And I know data is always a problem for us. I mean, we can give more anecdotal evidence, but if you have any kind of idea of how many cases there are of denied boarding or not possible to access a bus station, for example, this is really important to collect. Just now, maybe you can already start collecting it, and then we can put it all together once the consultation starts. They also will focus on 3 case studies, because they have noticed that bus and coach, with bus and coach, if we mean mainly things like connections like, for example, Flixbus, Eurolines, these kind of bus and coach travel. So this is like long distance, but scheduled services, as Mher said. So these kind of seem to be, like, let's say, a bit of a rogue player. We hear a lot of complaints that even the regulators have problems that they don't adhere to the rules. So that's why I think they focus on these 3 case studies. So there will be one on travel disruptions. So what will happen if there's force majeure events and problems, provision of information, and the complaint handling. And because this is also an issue actually in many other transport modes. And then similar in the situation for the sea and inland waterways is that now they have they are starting this evaluation, and we actually need to make sure that, like, between again March and July, but probably now a bit delayed, we are ready to answer questions. And I know that there have been before already a lot of reports, and an issue is that the regulation is already not applied correctly, but it also has these gaps, as I mentioned, that, for example, not all boat services are actually included here. The accessibility of vessels is also a problem that we hear several times, that in some cases, for example, if you have a car ferry, that persons with disabilities with impaired mobility were forced to stay on the car deck, which actually is not allowed, and it is dangerous because there was no accessible way to enter the passenger deck. So these kind of things should really be a thing of the past. So this should be combined with some accessibility rules or a reference to different standards. So, and we hope that the report will be published next year, so we can actually use this report, which hopefully will be strong enough to push the Commission to actually then come up with a legislative proposal to solve some of these problems. So now this was more the EDF position and the timeline that we'll be following, so for this year and the next year, and how to get involved. So I think obviously the easiest way is just to stay in touch with us, with EDF, and those of you who already are members of our email expert groups, for example, you are very well aware, but those of you who are not, please join our expert groups. It's really useful, I think, and it's in a two-way street, let's say. We provide you with information, but obviously we also really look forward to feedback from you, from your member state, from your city. So I'm really happy that we have a lot of very active experts that are really, really great. So if you are interested in this, you can join us. You can drop us an email later. You will find our contact details at the end. And the only requirement is that you have to be nominated by one of our member organizations. But since there are over 100, I think there hopefully will be a possibility. Also, of course, the Commission publishes all their open consultations. If you're interested in this, there's the link here in this slide. There you can choose, for example, a policy area. So if you choose transport, then you can find all the consultations open on transport. You can reply even as an individual citizen. You don't have to do it as part of an organization. You can just give your opinion as John Smith or Jane Smith and write what you think about it, or you can also do it as a part of an organization as a more official position. And of course, please subscribe to our newsletter. The link is also here in this slide, the second link on the slide, and you should also be informed about major initiatives. But here I have to say this is the public newsletter, so you will probably not get all the detailed policy input that you would get as an expert. And also, if you are not officially part of the EDF members newsletter, so EDF members mailing, you could maybe ask somebody in an organization that is member of EDF to either forward you the newsletter or also put you on the list, because I think if you receive the members mailing, this is the best chance to also keep in touch. But this, we cannot just put you on it. You have to receive this via the official member organization. And also, as I mentioned, just send us your informal feedback. I think this is really useful. You know that in the Commission, in the Parliament, in the Council, they're civil servants, but they're also just people. So if you send your stories of how you were denied boarding, how your wheelchair was damaged when you were flying and you did not get a compensation, this is really important to have these stories. And I think Andre will agree with me, he's the communications expert. So in situations in which your rights have not been respected, where member states are not applying the regulation correctly, and any other issue related to accessibility, or the lack of it, and staff training, for example, because all of this can be addressed in the regulations. Or if you have tried to complain to national authorities like the NEBs and they have not answered, or the answer was not satisfactory, all of this we would like to hear. And maybe just to finally, this is now my last comment. So just to distinguish, so what is the difference between in situations where your rights have not been respected and the application of the regulations? So it can be that a member state is actually more in a systematic breach of the regulation, so that they, for example, refuse to apply one part. So if they refuse to completely apply Chapter 5 of the Rail Passengers' Rights Regulation, this is a systematic breach, which can actually then also be followed up by the Commission. Whereas if it's about your individual right in a situation where you had problems when traveling by bus or by coach, this is more like, let's say, an individual complaint, which obviously is also important, but it's dealt with on a different level. I think this was now the most important things I mentioned. The last thing, yes, because Mher also said it. So the problem with the compensation for mobility equipment is indeed something that we should address. And there is also at the moment an ongoing legislative procedure, which has been already blocked for a really long time, I think since 2013. So we are hoping actually that we will be finishing with this, and we will add a clause, and this is the deal, that you will have to do the special declaration of value, as Mher called it, but that this should be for free if it is for mobility equipment. So this is maybe just to add, because I forgot it in the slide, and this is our position on this, but again, it will be later in the link section. I'm finished with my part, and I pass back to Andre. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Mher. We have a few questions, so I'll just get into it. I will start by asking two questions related to rail regulations. So the first one to Mher is regarding accessibility information. And the question is, what is the definition of accessible, clear and accessible information in the rail regulations? And is visual information included in this regulation, especially information at the station, at the platform, and in the train? And I just want to add, we have another train-related question, so maybe we can answer both at the same time. In the context of the COVID pandemic, Belgium train companies have abandoned their service of assistance for persons with disabilities. Do you confirm that this is permitted in these regulations? So I would say Mher would start answering, and then Marie could come in.
Okay, you can hear me, right?
Yes, no problem.
The first question about the information in the rail regulation. So the law says that persons with disabilities can request information about the railway station and the trains, and that this information should be provided in a way that is accessible for persons with sensory impairment, with the best information on delays, visual and audible systems should be used. So it does not really make very specific details on how the accessibility of the information should be made, but in general it states that this information should be accessible to persons with, as the law says, auditory and visual impairment. So then I guess it's given to the specific service to decide how they want to make this accessibility possible. But in general, this information has to be accessible to persons with visual and auditory disabilities. If this answers the question.
Thank you.
If you want, I can answer the part on the assistance and the COVID-19, if that's okay, Mher.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, no, officially it's not allowed. I mean, officially they cannot go against this regulation. But as you may have seen, there are a lot of things happening at the moment, which are in a very specific, happening in specific circumstances. And obviously there was no clause in the regulation foreseeing, let's say, in case of a pandemic, assistance can be stopped. No, they are technically in breach of the regulation right now. But honestly, I really doubt that this will have any long-term actions from the Commission, as long as this is a temporary measure, because everything now with COVID time, they phrase it as temporary measures. But what we have done is actually we have already written to the Commission, because they are now developing also recommendations for an exit strategy of COVID. This is of course a huge topic. I will not go into detail, but on rail transport, so we recommended that this, for example, should definitely not be allowed anymore. So assistance has to be resumed if it has been suspended, such as in Belgium, directly as soon as normal passenger services are already taking up again. So this is like a huge problem, of course, that we have also already criticized directly when this happened. And now the Commission should include this also in their recommendations, so that assistance has to be available. Yeah, that's the short answer.
Thank you very much, Marie and Mher. The next question is regarding access to safety and size of vehicle concerns. So who and how is the assessment done when the mode of transport denies access to safety and or size of vehicle? Maybe Mher could answer.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this will be done by, I guess, the national enforcement body, and usually you have to contact the national enforcement body of the which is located in the country where the incident took place. So it doesn't matter, let's say, if the airline is, I don't know, Belgian. If you've been denied boarding in Germany with Brussels Airlines, then you have to contact, I think, the German national enforcement body, and sometimes they might be in touch with the Belgian one to kind of, if there is internal the need for internal discussion. But the short answer is the national enforcement body. There will assess.
Yeah, maybe just to add, this is one of the big criticisms that we also have, that it is absolutely not clear how it is assessed, or really, I mean, even the national enforcement bodies, we don't know if the people working there have the technical knowledge to really assess this, or are they even going to the place and looking at the bus, or are they even looking at the airplane? I doubt it, honestly. Some of them do audits, but I think this is a problem, that there's no guidelines that says like, oh, the door minimum width of the airplane door has to be like this. No, and the issue is that if in some cases you book a flight and it is a small aircraft, that they just tell you actually when you're at the airport, and they don't tell you beforehand. So the problem is that lack of transparency of this assessment. I think this is a huge problem.
Thank you very much. The next question is regarding built environment. The problems with built environment are always able to deny accessible service. Is there a need to upgrade infrastructure in order to allow accessible services to be provided, or is that in the domain of the member states or service providers? Maybe Marie, you could take this one. It's regarding
Yeah, sure. No, yeah, indeed. This is one also of the criticisms, as we said, that accessibility is not really linked in these regulations at all. So they give you the right to travel, they give you the right to using the services such as assistance, but it does actually not say that the station building or the bus station has to be accessible. So we see this as a big gap. So as I said, this is at the moment in national law, and to some parts in EU law. So for rail, I think here is the big exception we should mention, because there's an additional regulation which we didn't mention today, because it is really about the technical requirements for the accessibility of stations and of trains. So in rail is the only transport mode where we on EU level have specifications and requirements for the built environment. So actually there we have, let's say, we're already a step further, but this does not exist in the other transport modes. So it's completely national. If you look at airports, if you look at bus stations, or at ferry terminals and ports. So yeah, unfortunately, in that case, there is no way, no EU law prohibiting inaccessibility.
If I can add to that just very shortly, of course, the accessibility of built environment is most of the times it's by national regulations and by national standards. But at the moment, there is a European standard being developed, which is basically a big guiding document on how to build accessibly. So if you were building, I mean, also it considers transport facilities, and so whenever there's a new station being built, how they can build it accessibly, or if the station is being or the airport is being refurbished, how to make it accessible. So this document will be published hopefully by the end of this year, and I think I would encourage everyone to promote it and to make sure that we have a kind of a harmonized way of accessibility throughout the EU as much as possible, because oftentimes it's people know how to deal with things in their own countries, but when they travel, they face the barriers because they could not anticipate that they can face a certain kind of problem if they don't have this in their country, for example.
Thank you very much. I will take a couple more questions as we are reaching the end of the webinar. But I think there's some one or two questions that are very important to answer. And if we didn't get to your question, you always feel free to email Mher and Marie to get an answer to it. So the next question is, does the European Accessibility Act have an impact on transport? And if yes, which kind of impact? Marie, would you like to take this one?
Yes, this is my favorite question, and actually also one of our again biggest grievances I think that we had with the Accessibility Act. For those of you who have been following this journey, let's call it, from the start to the end, so we were really hoping that this Accessibility Act, which is a law that provides requirements for products and services, would actually also solve some of these problems of accessibility, because this, as I mentioned, is a gap in between the passengers' rights and the actual, let's say, reality. The problem is that in the end, what we ended up with was a very good law on accessibility of digital products and services. So everything that is more related in the digital domain actually was really good. But the problem is that it excludes basically everything in terms of physical infrastructure and vehicles. So what we have included, and which is related to transport under the Accessibility Act, is the websites and the web applications of transport services. So everything, for example, the app of Deutsche Bahn has to be accessible. All the services, for example, on the website to buy tickets, etc., this will have to be accessible. So this already is a huge improvement, I would say. And in terms of physical changes, what they will be, so all the check-in machines at airports, all the ticketing machines of trains, but also wherever you have ticketing machines, they will also have to become accessible. Unfortunately, they have also a very long deadline for this. So we will see if this will actually be a useful clause in the regulation or not. But unfortunately, so everything is excluded in terms of trains or buses or even anything on local transport. So to be even more precise, your metro ticketing machine does not have to be accessible. Your bus tickets that maybe you can buy at the local bus station also doesn't have to be accessible. So again, we see there's an issue with too many exemptions. But so websites, mobile applications, ticketing machines, and check-in machines, and self-service terminals in general. So everything that is to do with self-service, in that case also in transport, will have to be accessible.
Thank you very much, Marie. I will go for a last question as we need to finish in 2 minutes. And I'm sorry that I will not be able to answer all the other questions. I see that there are questions that will still be missing. The next question is about taxis. Taxis are frequently used by disabled people. What can you tell about taxi regulations? Maybe Mher, you can take this one.
Sure. I am not aware that there's an EU regulation that would regulate this, but I think this is more on a national level. You can, if you have an issue like a denial of to be provided service by the taxi service, this can go and under the national anti-discrimination laws, because taxi services are services, and if you are denied service because of your disability, then this is a violation of your right, and there are national equality and anti-discrimination laws. In this case, I would advise maybe to contact your national equality body, which are especially focused on providing assistance to persons who are discriminated against. If you want, we can later send you the link. If you send us an email, I can send you the link with your national equality body. But if I don't know if on EU level there is no really regulation on this.
Thank you very much.
There is no EU regulation. Mher is totally right. It's national. Unfortunately, what I can add is that as EDF, we have made an effort to collaborate with the International Road Transport Union to have guidelines for taxis that we developed a few years ago. So it's a soft measure, but it was in the sense of what we can do on EU level. And at the moment, still, that's what we have done. But obviously, we would prefer that there was a harmonized rule also, because there have been a lot of new services coming up, as you know, with Uber, like these more informal services, and these are also not regulated at all. So I think this is something maybe to look at for the future for sure. So we would definitely prefer there to be EU regulations.
Thank you very much. We will have to finish now. I took note of the questions that we were not able to answer, and I will coordinate with the speakers to provide an answer. So thank you very much for everyone for attending and for the interest in this webinar. And again, thank you to our interpreters, Lisan Gadinans, to Tina, our live captioner, and also to Raquel, our colleague that is organizing the logistics. As I said, we will provide the resources and the recording of this webinar in the coming days. And if you don't have additional questions, don't hesitate to send it to us. In a few moments, when the webinar ends, you will see a short feedback survey that you can answer, but it is optional. So thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers and to everyone attending, and have a very nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.